Now let's talk about the Republican tax bill. This is a bill which will raise taxes on millions of middle-class families. Now, it gets worse in a few years. There's a bit of a bait and switch. They'll want to tell you, just look at how this bill will affect your tax return in 2019. Well, if you plan to still be alive in 2027, take a look at the effect it's going to have then. Let's look at middle-class families. Not the poorest 20% in our country, not the richest 20%, that middle 60%. Roughly 30% of those families in the middle class are going to see a tax increase on their 2027 tax return. And that tax increase is calculated at an average of $1,300 per family. Well, let's look at the individual provisions to see how fair they are to middle-class families. First, right off the bat, they take away the personal exemption, which on next year's tax return, the first year that this new bill would be effective, is worth $4,150 per person in your family. That's nearly $21,000 for a family like mine of five. They take away $21,000 of deductions, even from the poorest families in America and from every middle-class family as well. Now, they say they're going to replace that with a child tax credit, but if your children are over age 16, that credit is limited to a few $100s next year, and then they make it zero 5 years from now. So if your kids are going to turn age 17 sometime in the next 5 years, they've got your name on this bill. And they also do increase the standard deduction. But tens of millions of Americans don't even take the standard deduction. They choose to itemize their deductions. So one replacement is inapplicable in a few years to kids of a few years old, and the other is inapplicable to the millions of families that don't itemize their deductions. But even if it is applicable to you, you're losing for a family of five $2,100 roughly. And what about a family of six, a family of seven, a family of eight? Another $4,150 per child. And they replace it with an increase in the standard deduction of $1,200 and a per child credit of $600 or $300 or absolutely zero if your kids are over age 16 and it's a few years from now. Next, let's talk about moving expenses. The current code says that you're working at a factory and it closes down and it's moving 100 miles, 300 miles away, and you have to move your home. You have to find a new home to live in. You get to deduct your moving expense. They take that away. But what do they leave? If you own a factory and you shut it down and you move it to China, all of the moving expenses are tax deductible. So don't let them tell you they're taking away the moving expense deduction. Sure, they're taking it away from individuals and employees, but they are leaving the moving tax deduction for those who are moving their factories to China. And of course, they take away the student loan debt interest deduction. So if you are investing in yourself or in a family member, in education, the interest deduction wiped off your tax return. But if you're investing in a Chinese factory, the deductions are there for you. So they're not anti-investment. They're just anti-investment in the skills and capacities of American workers. Next is the medical deduction. You know, there is a deduction for medical expenses. It's available only to a few families with particularly large medical needs, because you don't get the medical deduction unless your medical expenses unreimbursed medical expenses, and thanks to the Affordable Care Act, most people have at least decent insurance. But you still have some medical expenses that are out of pocket. If your out-of-pocket medical expenses exceed 10% of your income, then to the extent of that excess, you can take a deduction. So if your out-of-pocket uncovered medical expenses are 13% of your income, you can deduct the 3%. That's not overly generous. It's not even applicable to most families. Who needs it? People with disabilities, families with children with special needs, people with cancer and other severe diagnoses. That's who they target. And they say, well, if you make some money and then you have to spend it dealing with medical services, dealing with therapies for special needs children, for disabled, for cancer, well, just because you don't have the money because you had to spend it on medical services doesn't mean we can't tax you on the money. And they do. Well, there's another group of people who are unlucky enough to have extraordinary expenses, and that is casualty losses. So if you have a small fire or some small casualty, you're not going to get a deduction. The deduction applies only when your casualty losses exceed 10% of your income, and then only to the extent that they exceed 10% of your income. We've had the wildfires in my state of California, not to mention the hurricanes in the Caribbean, and there are people who are going to say, well, thank God if the disaster had to hit our community, it hit us in 2017 because our casualty losses are deductible. But what about the next disaster? People with uninsured out-of-pocket losses exceeding 10% of their income will not get a deduction. Here's the Republican response. They say, look, if it's an enormous disaster that happens to take your house and the CNN cameras are there, then your congressional delegation can come beg for a special tax rule for those affected by that disaster. Well, first, what if your home burns down and CNN isn't there? Because it's not part of an enormous disaster, it's just something that hits you and a couple of neighbors. You'll never get a special tax provision. We're not going to write one for 3 or 4 people or 30 or 40 people or 80 or 90 people affected by a small brush fire. But what if you are part of the next enormous catastrophe? Your congressional delegation will be here having to decide whether to bargain to give you a chance to take the same deduction that's been in the code since the 1950s, or whether to bargain to try to get disaster relief to rebuild the infrastructure and the public assets in your community. Your congressional delegation probably doesn't have enough clout to do both, so which are they going to do? It is clearly wrong and unfair to tax people on that portion of their income that they have to use to deal with a truly extraordinary casualty loss. But there's another provision. This one hasn't been talked about much. And that is the way in which they index code provisions for inflation. There's some of the provisions they don't index at all. So they say, well, you can take your property tax deduction and itemize it as long only the portion up to $10,000. Well, $10,000 sounds like a lot of money. But they don't index it. So what about 10 years from now? What about 20 years from now? You say, well, I won't be in my house 20 years from now. Yes, but the person you sell your house to will be there. And if they say, my God, all the prices are higher, all the wages are higher, all the taxes are higher, that $10,000 limit on property taxes means I basically can't deduct but half my property tax bill, that will be factored into the price of your house. So, as to the things affecting home ownership, no indexing. Everything that looks big now gets smaller and smaller every year as a result of inflation. And oh, by the way, this tax bill is going to cause more inflation. But then there are other provisions where they say they're keeping the indexing, but they change from CPI indexing to chained CPI indexing. What does that mean? It's a system for indexing the brackets less than would be if you just looked at the consumer price index. So you say, well, I'm only going to be in the 25% bracket on this, under this bill. And as I get raises to just compensate me for inflation, I'll still just be in the 25%. No, you won't, because if you're fortunate, your employer will adjust your wages for real inflation, but the brackets are only going to increase for chained CPI. We take away the state and local tax deduction. First, this is a departure, as other provisions are, from the concept that we should tax people based on their ability to pay. If you make a certain salary and 10% of it is taken out and used by your local and state governments, then your ability to pay is the 90% of your salary you get to keep. But they don't want to tax you on what you keep after state and local taxes. They want to tax you on the money that has already been spent on taxes. The effect of this is not just on the middle-class families who are going to lose the tax deduction on their return and be taxed unfairly. Because if you read what is put out by the right-wing think tanks, they say, we know why we're pushing this state and local tax deduction elimination. Because that will create a political atmosphere where states like California and New York and New Jersey will slash the amount of money that they spend on things like public service, public safety, and education. And so we won't just be affecting the people who are not taking the tax deduction. We'll be turning to poorer families and lower middle class families who depend upon public schools, and will just cause a political situation where less money is spent on local education. So this doesn't just affect those who it affects on their tax return. This affects everyone who lives in the community. Now, they, as I've alluded to before, take away a big chunk of the home mortgage deduction, particularly to the person you'd sell your house to later. So if you sell your house, and God knows what the inflation rate will be, it may be significant, it may be $500,000, doesn't sound like a whole lot of money then, even though it does sound like a big chunk of money now. I remember when $50,000 for a home was thought to be a very high price. So anyway, the home mortgage deduction, limited for that buyer to $500,000 of mortgage. And the property tax limited to $10,000 of property tax. What effect is this going to have on the ability to sell your home, which in many parts of the country is your whole nest egg? People in my part of the country pay a big mortgage payment every month, and they have equity in their home. And maybe they can retire because they've got 20, 25% equity in their home. Well, yesterday, before the Financial Services Committee, we had testifying Mark Zandi, one of the leading economists in this country, who the head of the economics operation at Moody's Analytics. And he said that in major metropolitan areas like the one I represent, we're going to see a double-digit decline in home values as a result of this bill. A lot of that is the limit on home mortgage deduction and the property tax. There are other elements of this bill that also adversely affect home prices. Double-digit decline. And then what does that do to the community? You may say, I don't own a home. I just work at a restaurant. I live in an apartment. Who's going to be able to, is going to come to that restaurant, and how big are they going to tip if they've just been told, they go to Zillow and they see the value of their home, and oh my God, we've seen a double-digit decline. The whole community. And so whether and this affects folks from the New York metro area, the Philly metro area, Los Angeles, San Diego, Orange County in California. You're sucking money out of the local economy and giving it to the federal government by taking away the state and local property tax deduction. You're then slashing the value of homes, double-digit decline. What money is going to be in circulation to buy goods and services to support the entire regional economy? This is going to hit like a hurricane even areas of the country that did not experience a hurricane. Now, my party is so focused on the great unfairness of this bill. The fact that it provides the bulk of its benefits to the top 5%, even the top 1%. And that fact is hidden by the anomaly that most of the economic projections of this bill don't even look at the repeal of the estate tax. They only look at the income tax provisions. You can't just exclude a whole chunk of this tax bill in analyzing it. But we as a party are so focused on the huge unfairnesses that we almost don't want to talk about the effect it will have on the overall national economy. This isn't just an unfair bill. This isn't just a bill that enriches the rich. This is a deficit-exploding, outsource-promoting, job-killing, growth-reducing disaster for our nation's economy. Now, you want to know the effect of huge tax cuts on an economy? Look at Kansas. They slashed their taxes, and now a Republican legislature is reversing it because of what that has done to tax receipts and to the Kansas economy. But let's take a look and see what effect this is likely to have at the national level. And I turn to the Center for on Budget and Policy Priorities, where they say that this tax cut is an ineffective way to spur economic growth and is likely to harm the economy if it adds to the deficit. Well, what's the plan in the budget Republicans all voted for? To deliberately use this tax cut to increase the deficit by $1.5 trillion. But the Congressional Budget Office, under Republican administration of this House and of this Congress, says it's going to do $1.7 trillion. But they say, well, let's look at it more dynamically. If you look more dynamically, it's going to increase the deficit by $2 or $2.5 trillion because it raises interest rates, it encourages offshore investment, stripping economic growth out of the United States, and for a host of reasons I'll get to. The more you look at the tax cut, the more apparent it is that it will cut economic growth and increase the deficit by even more than the $1.7 trillion that the Congressional Budget Office, during Republican control of Congress, the Congressional Budget Office is currently estimating. Why is this? Well, first, because incentives to invest in the tax code have little or no effect on private savings, according to a Congressional Research Service report. Because the empirical evidence in numerous reports shows that the 2003 tax cuts had little impact on investment or employment. Now, I speak with a little bit of experience here because I lived 20 years of my life in the tax world, most of it right at the intersection of investment and tax law. I sat with families and charged them a large amount per hour to describe what the latest tax law said and what investments, what effect it would have on different investments. And my experience as a CPA and tax attorney and certified tax law specialist by my state bar was identical to that of Warren Buffett, who said, "I've worked with investors for 60 years and I have yet to see anyone, not even when capital gains rates were at 39.9%, or when they were 15% as they are now. I've never seen anyone shy away from a sensible investment because the tax rate on the because of the tax rate on the potential gain. People invest to make money, and potential taxes have never scared them off. Now, that is why when you look at the effect of this bill, you come to the conclusion, as the Congressional Budget Office did in looking at the Bush tax cuts and whether to extend them or allow them to expire, that if you have taxes and you use that money to pay the deficit, that does more to help the economy. It is more important to fight the deficit than it is to tell various families, often at the very high end, that they get a tax cut. Well, let's look at American economic history. I've designed this chart here, and I focused it only after the 1986 tax cut for which Ronald Reagan is famous. There were many things about our economy back in the early 80s and the 70s and 60s that aren't relevant today. We didn't have the trade policies back in the 70s that we have today. So we look at the Ronald Reagan 1986 tax policy as slightly adjusted by George H.W. Bush. We look at the policies that we had. Now, I know the 86 tax law, you think, well, that must have affected 86. No, it really became effective in 88. So you look at 88 to 93, and you see that we had economic growth of 2.67%. Then, in 1994, you see the effect of the Clinton tax policies adopted in 1993. And we see economic growth of well over 4%. And these figures here are real economic growth per year adjusted for inflation, 4.4%. So then George W. Bush gets elected, and starting in 2001, his tax policies are adopted by this Congress and enacted into law. And we see that economic growth is only 1.7%. Now, those Bush tax policies continued in force until 2013 because Democrats allowed them to stay in force until we finally adopted Obama tax policies effective in 2013. Those policies continue to be in force right up to today. And the most recent statistics we have are up through September 30th of this year. The economic growth under those policies has been 2.22%. So what we've seen here is that when we adopt Republican economic policies and they become effective, we have substantially lower economic growth than when we adopt Democratic tax policies and when Democrats actually pass those policies and have the guts to pass those policies and put them into law. So you've got to admire the Republican Party. They're able to get member after member after member to say without any proof that trickle-down economics works, that if you just cut taxes, you somehow help the economy. It doesn't matter if you can line up 100 members to say the same falsehood at the same lectern in the same congressional hall, on the same House floor. What matters is the real history, and the real history is that the higher rates imposed under Democratic administrations have not just led to higher tax revenues, they've led to higher rates of economic growth. Well, why is this? Well, first, and perhaps most important, is having money available for business investment. There's a pool of savings capital available in our markets and in our economy. And the Republican proposal would come in and scoop $1.2 trillion of that, take it out of the markets, take it out of the banks where it could be lent to small businesses, take it out of the bond markets where it can be used for expansions by big business, and just use it to pay for the tax cuts. No wonder tax cuts that increase deficits hurt business investment and hurt the economy. But there's more. We then add to our national debt, and the national debt is forever. Not only do we have the increase in the debt of $1.5 to $1.7 trillion, but that debt will be here not just 10 years from now, it's there forever. Your great-grandchildren are going to be paying interest on that debt. But then we have the international impact. You see, their proposal provides for a 0% tax, 0% U.S. tax on any money made by any factory as long as you move that factory abroad. And if the wage rates are too high in China, you can put it in Vietnam. Now, they do, in addition to saying you move your factory abroad, you pay zero tax on all the manufacturing profits. But because that manufacturing is being done abroad, so we encourage moving the factory abroad, the work is being done abroad, we don't tax it. But in addition, what is an area of economic activity where Americans excel? It is the creation of intellectual property. While the manufacturing might be done abroad, the design, the patents, the copyrights, the trade names, the marketing plans, the trade secrets, the intellectual property is created here. But under this bill, not only the profit you make on the foreign factory, but the profit you make from all that intellectual property can pay almost a 0% American tax if you just take that patent and put it in a file in the Cayman Islands. Now, I don't want to say that our current system for taxing international transactions is anything that we can be proud of. The present system, if you make money in a U.S. factory, has a tax of 35%. You make it in a foreign factory, we also have a tax of 35%, but you can defer it. So right now, if you're just trying to decide where to put the factory, you've got a tax in the United States that you actually have to pay, and a tax on a factory abroad that you'll pay eventually. Well, what do? They take that 35% eventually tax and turn it into a 0% forever tax. How much more incentive could they provide to move American factories overseas? Now, the present system also has a problem in that you can defer tax only on the money you keep offshore. So their solution is to say, well, bring it onshore, we'll provide a little tiny tax on it, and then all the money you've made overseas the last 10 or 20 years, no U.S. tax. And at least the money gets repatriated. Democrats are anxious to work with Republicans on repatriation. They could probably get a more Republican plan adopted than one that I would endorse in this speech. But why not tax the unrepatriated money? That way we would be saying, bring that money back or don't bring it back. You pay the same tax, so you might as well bring it back. What we can also do is move to worldwide unitary apportionment. Eliminate all the tax games, and most of them are international. Eliminate all the reasons to move factories abroad and generate another $1 trillion every 10 years for our Treasury. That's the system that we ought to be moving to. I'm not here to say our present system is wonderful. I'm here to say that we should not adopt the Republican system because it moves us even further away from what would be a fair system that would not encourage offshoring. Another way in which we're affected internationally is that this tax bill would change currency values, change the exchange rate between the euro, the yen, the Chinese currency, renminbi, and other currencies around the world, in a way that will encourage Americans to import and discourage those abroad from buying our products. Just another economic harm. Another economic harm is touted by the conservative supporters of this policy. They say that by cutting taxes, we'll get the federal government and state and local governments to spend less money on infrastructure and education. Well, if you want to ask what is it that makes a country wealthier than others, it's first and foremost the education of its workers, and then second, the infrastructure that's available to productive activity. In addition, as I mentioned before, they're going to cut the value of homes nationwide, most pronounced in the major metropolitan areas. What does that do to middle-class spending, which drives our economy? It drives that middle-class spending down. Who's going to go out to a restaurant if you've just been told that you've had a double-digit decline in the value of your home? This bill will also cause higher interest rates because the federal government's going to be borrowing another $1.5 trillion to $1.7 trillion. Now, so there is a difference between me and my party leadership. They say that the main reason to vote against this bill is that it is unfair by giving huge tax breaks to the top 1% and increasing taxes for millions of American families. I say you should vote against this bill because it's a deficit exploding, outsourcing promoting, job killing, economic growth depressing bill. But I think we'll agree, whether you vote against this bill because it's unfair or you vote against this bill because it's bad for our economy, you will be performing an important service to our country. But let me not neglect the fact that if you vote that the bill isn't totally without being useful to somebody, it will reduce taxes for the Donald Trump family by over $1 billion in estate tax and tens of millions of dollars in income tax. But maybe that's not enough for you. Look at what it will do for the Koch brothers, far more than it will do for the Trump family. So if that's important to you, if that's the result you want to achieve, then vote for the bill. By 2027, roughly a third of middle-class families will be paying more in taxes, and that average family will be paying $1,300 more. The personal exemption, worth $4,150 per person in the family, that's $21,000 for a family of 5, they take it away. The moving expense deduction, if you have to move to keep your job, you don't get to deduct that. But if you move a factory to China, you get to deduct all the moving expenses. Student loan debt, they won't let you deduct it. As for the effect on simplicity, my homeboys, my CPA and tax law homeboys are going to be rolling in big dollars, because just from the provisions that define the difference between personal service income, passive income, active business income, the litigation and planning opportunities, talk about complexity, it's all there, and my homeboys love it. We can currently deduct extraordinary medical expenses. That's important to those with disabilities and families with children with special needs. They wipe it out. The extraordinary casualty loss deduction, they wipe out. Very important to people who face floods and fires. They change the rules so we don't have adequate indexing for inflation, so everybody's pushed into a higher tax bracket by inflation, except those at the very top. They are protected. But look at the effect on our nation's economy. This is a job-killing, deficit-exploding, growth-reducing disaster. Look what happened to Kansas. These policies have already devastated one of our states. You're going to be taking $1.5 trillion out of the money available for business investment.
The federal government will come in and borrow all that money, leaving less money for factories, farms, and homes. And as Ron Kine pointed out, there's an extra $800 billion of interest on top of that just the next 10 years. And keep in mind, this increase in our debt is forever. Your grandchildren will be paying taxes on this debt. Look at the chart. We had the policies of Ronald Reagan from 1988, when his 1986 law became effective, through 1993. And we had 2.67% growth. In 1994, we got Clinton tax policies. We exploded to over 4% annual growth. Then with George W. Bush, we dropped to 1.7. And then when we adopted Obama tax policies, which are in force today, we're back up to 2.2% economic growth. Which policies give you economic growth? Let's look internationally. They say if you move you can manufacture and pay 0% on the profits you earn by a factory, but only, can I have one? But only if it's a foreign factory. Finally, Mr. Zandi, one of the top economists in the country, testified before a financial services committee that this bill means double-digit declines in the value of homes in American metropolitan areas. What effect does that have on the economy?
Time has expired.
Who's going to go out and spend in the middle class when they're told that the equity in their home has been virtually wiped out? So you can vote against this bill because it's unfair, or you can vote against this bill because it will be a crushing weight on our economy. But don't engage in the fantasy that you can cut taxes and make it up through, quote, economic growth.